cancel culture. Cancel culture is a term used to refer to the idea that marginalized people have enough power to enact socioeconomic consequences on powerful people who have hurt or irritated them. This is, of course, unrealistic and untrue because marginalized people lack that kind of power. And so usually what is referred to as cancel culture is the internet outrage of marginalized people who are discussing or asking for accountability from those who deliberately conduct misinformation campaigns against them, use hate speech, and attempt to infringe on their rights. An example of this being the anti-LGBTQIA+ bill in Ghana and the attempt to roll back women's reproductive health rights in America in the Roe versus Wade debate. So let's talk about cancel culture from the first perspective. The first perspective assumes that we all have equal stake in the systems that govern this world. These systems being white imperialism, ableism, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. And what we know just by the name marginalized is that marginalized people do not have an equal stake, and some have no stake at all in any of the systems that govern this world and are incapable of meting out that magnitude of justice even when it's deserved. What we know and appreciate is that without the system's input, without the system being willing to let go of its own for its own benefit, it's impossible to mete out that level of consequence. An example of this would be Derek Chauvin, whose arrest has not actually made Black Americans or people of color in general safe from police brutality and police murders. But the system was, for its own longevity and for its own credibility, willing to let go of one of its members to make it seem as if it had some level of self-reflective capacity. This happens multiple times. The system is willing sometimes to let go of people who rightfully so deserve these consequences without actually doing any of the internal work to make sure these things are not repeated again. So the only people with the capacity to cancel people and cause them some level of socioeconomic harm are people in positions of power, that being those with privileged identities. Now, this is not to say that cancel culture does not always work, but that it is very unlikely, especially at that magnitude. The system has to grant permission for you to have that kind of fallout if you're a person in a position of power. A person who can be cancelled easily and find it extremely difficult to maneuver the world with ease is a person who's already marginalized. Marginalized people can be cancelled and often struggle socioeconomically because they have already been cancelled by the governing system. An example of a person who required the system's permission to receive some level of accountability for their actions is R. Kelly, a known child molester and abuser with over 20 years of evidence stacked up against him. R. Kelly had marginalized people shouting and protesting and fighting for his deplatforming for many, many years before even I had gained any level of consciousness. But because the system was still profiting off his existence and his success, the system was unwilling to let go of him. And so after many, many years of the same people speaking up, documentaries being made, after all the tapes found with incriminating evidence, it was impossible to actually hand out or mete out any level of justice towards this man who was very deserving. What ended up happening was, as soon as it was no longer profitable for the system to keep him, and again to show that the system had some level of self-reflective capacity, which is false, the system has allowed some level of consequence to befall him. We're still not sure, because even then the system will take care of its own, will hand out certain parole. And we know in the case of Bill Cosby, where there was so much evidence stacked up against him and the women were right and he had confessed to doing all these things, he still managed to be protected by the system, and there was still a loophole to manipulate that would make this evidence that he gave, including his own confessions, insufficient to hand out some level of justice. And of course, we can have a broader conversation on abolition and why the prison industrial complex does not work or benefit marginalized people or harmed individuals in any way, shape, or form. But that's another conversation. What matters is that we understand that most cases of cancellation happen this way. And whilst I've given 3 extreme examples, this does not mean that people who cry foul and pretend they've been cancelled or speak about their cancellation have always done things at this magnitude. There are people online as well who've done despicable things or who have a track record of doing terrible things but continue to be platformed whilst moaning about how they had been cancelled or they've been the victims of this unforgiving system that harms people for no particular reason and through no fault of their own. A person like this is Kevin Hart, who doubled down on his old statements and chose not to show any sincerity to a community he had heard that was asking for some level of sincerity. Had he chosen to show sincerity, he would have managed to continue with this opportunity, but he decided to show this community that he did not care for them and the community was rightful in their outrage. Marginalized people, in this case LGBTQIA+ persons, were not the instigators of this scenario. Instead, after asking for some kind of accountability and some kind of sincerity from Kevin Hart, he decided to double down on his comments and has spoken about it ever since. Here he was at fault, he still didn't lose anything, and he still manages to be on some of the best and biggest platforms and has had multiple movie premieres from this date, if I'm not mistaken. I know at least one of those, whilst again talking about having been cancelled. Cancellation is not real. So now we know that in general, cancelled people just moan but continue to live relatively okay, profitable and comfortable lives. A person who deserves to be cancelled but continues to hold a platform is online sensation Jeffree Star, who continues to profit off his extremely large fan base, regardless of how many times he has actually harmed and hurt marginalized people. This is again another sign that marginalized people lack the power or the ability to deplatform people who hurt them, even when they deserve to do so. There will always be people who are willing to help. Bigotry is plenty, marginalized people are few. And this isn't to say that this scenario is solely or purely American. I simply use American examples because of the reach and broadness of American entertainment, and it's much easier to have those examples on your fingertips. But here on the continent, especially in Southern Africa, we know a thing or two about people who are harmful continuing to be platformed. There are multiple DJs, multiple entertainers, or persons in positions of power who continue to hold power regardless of how many times they've been called out or caught doing things that are harmful. Even back during the Me Too movement, when lists upon lists were made of harmful sexual assaulters in schools and in general who were known online, very little was done to deplatform or cause economic and social disadvantage to these people. These people have flourished, in fact. None of them have experienced any of the effects that cancel culture supposedly gives. So this is the culture of cancellation that most powerful people claim to live in fear of. This unforgiving, baseless, unwarranted system that exists for no particular reason at all. Having figured that out, here are my personal opinions on cancel culture and what I think we should do. I believe the outrage of marginalized people is always righteous. Marginalized people are never making noise or showing outrage for no particular reason. It's always because somebody has decided to instigate this thing. A scenario that happened recently is a situation with DaBaby, where he chose to say homophobic and untrue statements about HIV and its impact on the community. He, out of nowhere, for no particular reason, chose to go out of his way to say these things when he was supposed to just sing or rap, whatever he's meant to be doing there. And of course, people were rightful in their outrage. Outrage isn't always an issue of wanting the other person to suffer perpetually. Outrage usually asks for accountability, and in the absence of accountability, then marginalized people are within their rights if they choose not to platform or support a person's art, business venture, or whatever else they do. Marginalized people do not need to expose themselves to harm just to show that they are merciful and forgiving without accountability and some level of restitution being forgiven. As I've mentioned with the Kevin Hart scenario, multiple opportunities have been given to him to give some kind of an apology, to show sincerity, but he was unwilling to do so. And in the end, he managed to moan about how he had been robbed of this opportunity, but the only thing he had been asked to do was apologize. And that's all there is to cancel culture. It's not real, but outrage is very much real. And outrage definitely communicates things that we needed to communicate. Are the consequences people talk about real or legitimate? No, they are not. Unless you're another marginalized person being cancelled. Perhaps the system might be willing to let you go. You're expendable anyway. But in reality, cancel culture at the magnitude that people claim it exists does not exist. And that's all there is to it. That's it, you guys. Thank you so much for watching yet another video of mine. I hope you've subscribed. I hope you've turned on your post notifications. And I hope you've given this video a big thumbs up.